Hi, welcome to day 28 of our devotional study on the life of Jesus as seen in the book of Luke. We're nearly there. We are in Luke 23 and Jesus is under trial. Let me read to you from Luke 23 verses 8 to 25. Jesus has been in front of Pilate. Pilate hasn't found any charge against him, but he's been very relieved that he can pass him over to Herod and let Herod work out what to do with this problem. Verse 8 says, "When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform some miracle. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. And Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers and the people, and said to them, 'You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I've examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him.' With one voice they cried out, 'Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!' Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again. But they kept shouting, 'Crucify him! Crucify him!' For the third time he spoke to them. 'Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then release him.' But with loud shouts they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will." I'm going to stop there today. Jesus is being passed around. Pilate doesn't want to take responsibility for a decision regarding Jesus. Maybe he's scared that whatever he chooses, someone will hate him. His priority in Judea was probably just to keep peace at pretty much all costs. But Herod was intrigued. Who was this strange man who performed miracles and offended religious leaders? So Herod, and this isn't the Herod that actually had been visited by the Magi and tried to kill off the child king, Jesus, when he was born. This is another Herod. He's the original Herod's descendant. He asked Jesus a lot of questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. Why? I think we have two clues. Jesus in chapter 21 has warned the disciples that they will be handed over to religious and political authorities and that when they are, they mustn't worry about how to answer. That's Luke 21 verses 14 to 16. God will give them answers which can't be contradicted. Now Jesus is in that position, and Jesus, who has been able to respond perfectly to the Pharisees and every trick and challenge that's come before him, has chosen not to respond to Herod. Why? I think the answer is found in Proverbs 26 verses 4 and 5. It says, verse 4, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be like him yourself." But then verse 5 says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes." These appear to be contradictory, but they do show that there are times when we should answer a fool and foolish questions, and there are times when we should not. And maybe the question is, what result do we want? Are we more concerned about how we look to others, or are we more concerned about how they will see themselves? Or what, we're thinking about what the response will be, what the situation will be as a response to our response. So do we answer or do we not answer? Well, that depends upon the situation. When the Pharisees asked Jesus foolish questions, he answered. It prevented them from feeling that they had the upper hand, and it prevented people from thinking that Jesus was agreeing with them and therefore was like them. He did not wish to look like the Pharisees. But Herod already believed himself to be wise. No answer was going to change that, and there was no crowd witnessing this. The better decision for Jesus was to not answer at all. If we heard Herod's questions, we may fully understand why Jesus didn't answer. It may have been that no matter what he answered, there was never going to be an answer that gave the right representation. He's just taught his disciples that they can trust God to give them whatever answers they needed to give when they were under trial. Maybe God had given him no answer to give. In fact, I would quite easily say that God clearly had given him no answer. Otherwise, he would have given the answer that God gave him. Sometimes the answer that we need to give is no answer at all. When people feel ineffective in challenging our faith, commonly they'll mock it. And this is what Herod did. He was ineffective in his questioning. He got no response. So he reverted to mockery. He mocked Jesus, and he sent him back to Pilate. Pilate decided, he has done nothing to deserve death, therefore I will punish him and then release him. But the crowd aren't happy with that. One of the biggest failings of any leader is when they listen to mob rule, they listen to the crowd's clamour without weighing the situation for themselves. In this case, Pilate has weighed the situation, but he gives in to public request. In fact, it's public demand. Now we live in something close to a democracy, and it's right that leaders should, in our country, should respond to the requests of the people. The problem is we can tend to translate that into the spiritual world, and we can tend to expect the same in church life, that church leaders should do what church members want. But actually, although church leaders are the servants of the church, they're also members of it. And actually, our responsibility as God's children is to obey him, not to obey each other. We should serve each other, but that doesn't mean we obey each other. And at times I will frustrate people because they'll say, well, I want you to do this. And I'll say, well, I'm sorry, but God doesn't want me to do this. And they can get hurt or offended because I'm not responding to their perceived needs. But the reality is God has given me the response to give. He's told me how I should respond. Now, I'm human and I make mistakes, and sometimes I respond out of myself rather than out of what God is telling me. But my responsibility as a church leader is to obey God and do what he tells me to do and serve people how he wants me to serve them. If I just always respond to people's perceived needs, I will not have time to actually respond to their real needs. So my responsibility is to hear God and what he's saying on a matter. But Pilate here responds to mob rule. He gives in. Twice he said, I can find no reason to charge this man. In fact, before he sent him to Herod, he said that as well. So 3 times he said not guilty regarding Jesus. But the crowd said, crucify him. So Pilate crucified him. The thing with mob rule is that anything that seems to respond, or it seems to challenge culture, can be seen as a threat. Jesus was challenging their culture. They had a status quo. They had a situation they were comfortable with. They were unhappy with it, but they understood it and they knew the rules. Jesus was challenging that culture. He was saying there are different rules here. You're missing out on so much. The kingdom's rules are different. The response, crucify. Meanwhile, anyone who remains unsure about the situation capitulates. It's easier to go with the crowd than to take a stand. We find that in our culture today, that anything that challenges the accepted norms of society is seen as a threat. And people and crowds rule, and public consensus and online understanding will fight against anything that says that our culture is in some way lacking. When we challenge culture, we challenge the group, but we also challenge the individual, and it can be threatening to people when we stand up and say that we're not convinced of some of the norms of society being okay. We're not convinced that lifestyle choices and various decisions that people make in their lives are acceptable. Then we threaten the group and we threaten the individual. And they feel threatened and they come out fighting. Those who aren't sure capitulate to mob rule. Those who aren't sure of where they stand will just go with the flow of what most people say. And those who stand up, well, the crowd shouts, "Crucify." We must make sure that we don't make decisions based on what the general rule, the general population wants. We shouldn't fight against society just as a principle, just to prove ourselves in any way. But we must go with what God says. So here's my prayer points for today. Please, Lord, help me never to make decisions based upon whether people will like me. Help me to always choose what is right, no matter who will turn against me. Please, Lord, help me to ask you the right questions so that you will answer me. Help me to not think that I am wise, but to humble myself before you. Lord, please give me the wisdom to ask questions and to answer questions about you and faith only the way you tell me to. If you tell me to be silent, help me to be silent. There may be a lot going on, much more than I understand, and only you know the best way for me to answer that person at that time. Please, Lord, help me to never simply go along with the crowd for an easy life. I choose to follow you, no matter what the results. Amen. That's it for day 28. See you on day 29.